Layla Harrison sat at the front of the seminar room, her gaze sweeping over the students. The air in the room felt heavy, a mix of nervous anticipation and silent judgment. As a history professor at Willowbrook University, this wasn't her first class, but each new session always carried a subtle weight. She was still adjusting to her role as a professor, learning to balance her love for history with the responsibilities that came with teaching it. But today, her focus was sharp. The syllabus called for a detailed discussion on medieval Europe, and she intended to guide them through it as methodically as she could. The room was filled with the usual chatter of students settling into their seats. A few faces were familiar, students from previous classes. But there was one in particular that caught her attention today. Dylan Avery, seated near the back, had been unusually engaged since the first lecture. Layla had noticed how he offered insightful comments and asked questions that went beyond the material. At first, it was impressive. By the second week, it was starting to feel like something more. His presence wasn't like that of the other students. He had a certain air about him, something both magnetic and unsettling. As the lecture began, Layla tried to focus on the subject at hand, keeping her voice steady and professional. The students seemed to be following, their eyes glued to the notes in front of them. But Dylan, he was always watching her. She could feel his eyes on her even when she wasn't looking directly at him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made her stomach tighten. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that she was a professor. She couldn't afford to be distracted by one student. After the class ended, Layla was collecting her papers when Dylan approached her desk. His footsteps were quiet, but she heard them all the same, growing louder as he neared. She glanced up, finding him standing in front of her, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Professor Harrison," he said, his voice calm and even. "I had a question about the paper you mentioned in class. The one on the influence of the church in medieval politics. I wanted to clarify something if you have a moment." Layla nodded, slightly caught off guard by the request. Most students simply asked questions after class or emailed her, but Dylan's direct approach was different. "Of course. What do you need clarification on?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with interest. "You mentioned that the church's role was more political than spiritual during the early Middle Ages. I was wondering, do you think the shift in power had more to do with the collapse of the Roman Empire or the rise of the early monarchies?" Layla paused for a moment, surprised by the complexity of the question. Not many students had the insight to think beyond the surface of history like this. "That's a good question," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I'd say it's a combination of both, but the real shift came when the monarchies started consolidating power. The church was a tool, but it also had its own agenda." Their discussion deepened, but Layla couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about history anymore. Dylan's questions were more than academic. They felt personal, as though he was trying to understand her thoughts beyond the material she was teaching. She tried to focus, but she couldn't ignore the warmth in her chest. The warmth that came from his attentiveness, his subtle but clear admiration. Just as she was about to end the conversation, the door to the seminar room slammed shut, and the lights flickered out. The sudden darkness sent a chill through the room. Layla reached for her phone to check if the power had gone out, but there was no signal. The silence between them felt heavier now, and in the stillness, she realized they were alone. "You think it's safe to leave?" Dylan's voice broke through the quiet, but his tone wasn't just cautious. It was something else. Curiosity? Concern? Layla looked up at him, their eyes meeting in the dark. I don't think we have much of a choice." The doors locked. Dylan's smile was barely visible, but it was there, teasing the corners of his lips. "Looks like we're stuck then." And with that, they settled into an awkward silence, trapped in the dark room together. The days after the unexpected lock-in lingered in Layla's mind like an unspoken tension. She had spent hours trying to convince herself that it was nothing more than an accident. Just a strange coincidence. But each time she saw Dylan in class, her mind flickered back to the darkness of that room, the feeling of his presence so close, the quiet hum of their conversation, as the world outside had ceased to exist. She couldn't shake it. Dylan, for his part, had seemed to return to his usual self, confident, charming, the model student. But there was something different in the way he looked at her. An underlying current of familiarity that hadn't been there before. He didn't overstep, but there was a softness in his eyes whenever their gazes met. It was enough to make Layla uneasy, but she couldn't tell if it was the attraction she had suppressed or just the simple discomfort of mixing personal and professional lives. It wasn't long before the moment came again. The university library was quieter than usual, a rare piece that Layla had come to appreciate in the midst of her busy schedule. She was seated at a table near the back, grading papers under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her focus was on a particularly troublesome essay about the Norman conquest, but it didn't take long for her mind to wander back to Dylan. She could picture his expression from their last exchange. Intense, curious, a little too earnest for comfort. As if summoned by her thoughts, Dylan appeared at the library entrance, looking just as he always did. Casual yet somehow too put together. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her immediately. Despite herself, Layla straightened up and gave him a tight, professional smile. "Professor Harrison," Dylan greeted, his voice smooth and warm. "Do you mind if I sit here? I could use your input on something." She hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was really necessary. They weren't in class anymore. She wasn't required to offer academic guidance outside of office hours. But before she could decline, Dylan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, setting a book on the table between them. "I'm working on a research project for my thesis," he continued, "and I think you're the best person to help me refine my arguments." Layla's gaze shifted from his eyes to the book in front of her. "What's your project on?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "The role of women in medieval politics," Dylan said with an edge of excitement. "I know it's a bit of an unconventional topic, but I think it's important to understand the subtle ways women influenced power dynamics, even if they weren't always in the spotlight." Layla raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. She hadn't expected such a thoughtful choice of topic from a student who had a reputation for being more carefree than academic. "That's ambitious," she replied, her voice softer than she meant it to be. Dylan smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "I thought you might say that. I've been reading some of your research on the subject, and I'd really like to get your opinion. Do you think women's political influence was more covert or more direct than we give them credit for?" The question, simple as it was, made Layla pause. She hadn't expected to be drawn into a deeper discussion right now. Not with a student, but his genuine curiosity, the way he leaned in slightly, as if he valued her insight. It made it impossible to ignore. "It depends on the context," Layla said slowly, collecting her thoughts. "In some cases, it was covert, hidden behind the roles of wives, daughters, or mothers. But there were also women who wielded power openly, even if it was through manipulation or alliances." Dylan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I like that," he said quietly. "There's so much more to the story than we're taught in the textbooks." Layla couldn't help but smile. There was something refreshing about Dylan's eagerness, his passion for the subject. But that smile faded when she realized how easily they had fallen into a rhythm of conversation. It wasn't just academic anymore. It was personal. They were connecting, not just as teacher and student, but as two people with mutual respect for each other's ideas. Before she could respond, Dylan leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Professor Harrison," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" Layla's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she couldn't stop it now. "Of course," she replied, though her voice felt strained. Would you ever consider having dinner with a student? I mean outside of class. Just to talk more about the subject. Or about anything really. The question hit her like a sudden gust of wind. For a moment, Layla didn't know how to respond. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the heat in her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dylan watched her carefully, sensing her hesitation. I understand if you'd rather not, he added quickly. I just thought it might be nice to talk more about the research. You've got such a unique perspective on things. Layla closed her eyes for a second, collecting her thoughts. This wasn't just about the research. It never had been. I'm not sure it's appropriate, she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. Dylan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, though there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. I get it, he said quietly. I won't push. The conversation shifted back to academics after that, but the silence between them was heavy. Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, something she wasn't ready to confront. She tried to focus on the papers in front of her, but every word seemed to blur together. Dylan Avery was no longer just a student. Layla Harrison had always prided herself on her professionalism. It was her shield, the one thing that had kept her grounded through years of academia, pushing past personal disappointments and setbacks. But recently, that shield had begun to crack. Each time she saw Dylan Avery, whether in class, in the hallway, or even by chance at the university coffee shop, it became harder to keep her distance. It wasn't that Dylan was overly persistent. He respected her boundaries, always polite, never crossing the line between student and professor. But there was something about him, his intelligence, his charisma, the way he listened to her as if her words held weight. And then there were the subtle touches, the glances that lingered just a little too long, as if he could see right through her walls. It was enough to make Layla's heart race in a way she hadn't felt in years. That evening, after a long day of grading papers, Layla found herself walking to her office, her mind lost in a haze of exhaustion and doubt. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting eerie shadows on the corridor walls. When she reached her office, she was surprised to see Dylan standing outside the door, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jacket, and he shifted from one foot to the other. Professor Harrison, he said, his voice low but steady. Can I talk to you for a minute? Layla hesitated, but the softness in his tone, the way he avoided looking her directly in the eye, made it hard to say no. Of course, Dylan. What's on your mind? I know I've been a little forward lately, he began, his words stumbling out more quickly than usual. But I've been thinking a lot about our conversations. About history, about life, about everything, really. He took a step closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. And I just wanted to ask, do you ever feel like you're not living the life you're supposed to? The question caught her off guard. Layla blinked, unsure how to respond. Dylan Avery, always the confident student, was now speaking with a vulnerability that startled her. Dylan, she stopped herself. The truth was, she had asked herself that same question countless times. She had buried her own desires for the sake of her career, hiding behind her books and lectures, convinced that love and personal happiness were distractions she couldn't afford. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, Dylan's gaze softened. Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to break free from the walls you've built around yourself, to let someone in? The question was too direct, too intimate. Layla felt the weight of it pressed down on her chest. She wanted to retreat, to hide behind her professional mask once again. But something inside her, a part she hadn't let see the light in years, urged her to listen. I'm not sure that's something I can do, she said softly, looking away. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob, her grip cold and trembling. Dylan's eyes never left her face. Maybe you're not the only one who's afraid of breaking down those walls. There was a long silence between them, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. Layla's breath came a little faster, and she found herself caught between two forces: the career she had worked so hard to build, and the undeniable pull she felt toward Dylan, the unspoken connection that had formed between them, something that was too real to ignore. "I think we both know what's going on here," Dylan said quietly, stepping closer, his voice laced with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Layla. I've felt it too. The connection. The chemistry." Layla's heart raced as she stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She knew this was wrong, that it could complicate everything. But what if it didn't? What if this was the chance she had been waiting for? An opportunity to let go of her fears, to let herself feel something real again. Before she could respond, Dylan closed the small gap between them. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. The touch was electric, like a spark igniting in the dark, and it made Layla's heart leap in her chest. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice faltering. "This isn't right." But even as the words left her lips, she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Instead, she looked up into his eyes, finding the same mixture of longing and uncertainty that she felt within herself. "Maybe it's time for both of us to stop running," he murmured. In that moment, with the weight of the world outside the room, they came together. The kiss was tentative at first, slow, as if both of them were testing the waters, unsure of how far they could go. But as the world outside faded into the background, their connection deepened, and the walls that had kept them apart crumbled. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was something much more powerful. The promise of something new, something real. When they finally pulled apart, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of possibility, the understanding that neither of them would be the same again. "Are you sure about this?" Layla asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dylan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I think we both are."